Welcome to the Brain Over Binge podcast, where you learn a simple, brain-based approach to ending binge eating. I'm Kathryn Hansen. I'm the author of Brain Over Binge and the Brain Over Binge Recovery Guide, and my mission is to help you stop binge eating in the most efficient way possible, without needing to completely transform yourself or solve every issue in your life. But those of you who are regular listeners know that I also acknowledge that some issues can make recovery more challenging in certain situations or require someone to use additional tools. ADHD is one of those issues that may necessitate special considerations as you learn to navigate recovery and regulate your eating habits. And I have a guest on the show today to give you some expert advice about this. Her name is Dr. Paula Freedman-Diamond, and we're going to discuss the intersection of ADHD and neurodivergence with eating disorders and recovery. You'll learn some practical, compassionate strategies, as well as reminders to embrace self-acceptance and work with your unique brain, not against it. Even if you don't specifically struggle with ADHD or neurodivergence, you'll still find a lot of value in the information and the insights in this episode. We'll also address the broader topics of perfectionism and what Dr. Paula calls toxic striving, which is rampant in our culture and can fuel disordered eating behaviors. Dr. Paula is a clinical psychologist who specializes in anxiety disorders, ADHD, and eating disorders, and she brings a deep understanding of compulsive and impulsive behaviors to her work. She recently published a book called Toxic Striving, which unpacks the harmful messages from diet culture, wellness culture, and hustle culture, and she'll tell you much more about this during our conversation. Before we dive in, I want to remind you about two simple but powerful resources that can support you as you use the Brain Over Binge approach. The first is the new Brain Over Binge podcast guide, which is an interactive PDF that indexes the past episodes into over 85 recovery topics, and this helps you easily find the episodes that are most relevant to you. The podcast guide is only $2.99, and you can get it at brainoverbinge.com/podcast-guide, and that link is also in the show description. The second resource is completely free. It's the Brain Over Binge Inspiration Booklet, which is also an interactive PDF that I created to give you 1 month's worth of daily messages that will keep you focused, motivated, and taking the consistent actions you need to heal. You can download the free inspiration booklet through the link in the show description or directly from the homepage at brainoverbinge.com. And now I'm honored to be joined by Dr. Paula Freedman-Diamond. Welcome to the show, Dr. Paula.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's really great to talk to you. We have a lot of interesting topics. We're primarily going to focus on the relationship between eating disorders and ADHD, but we also have some other things to talk about just in general about how there is a lot of toxic striving in our culture. And you have a book with that title that just came out recently. So we're excited to dive in to all of that today. So before we get into that, can you please just introduce yourself to the audience as far as like what you do and some of your background?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a licensed clinical psychologist and a certified intuitive eating counselor. For a little over a decade now, I have developed a specialty treating, I call it like high achievers and people pleasers. So a lot of perfectionism, anxiety related concerns, things like OCD, and then eating disorders. And what I've found in my clinical practice is that there is a lot of overlap between those conditions. So what I found is that I like to work with people on the underlying efforts to seek control over what they're feeling inside and control over their bodies, control over how they're perceived by people. So a lot of times what I find is that when someone comes in and their primary concern is related to their relationship with food or their body image stuff, there is often sort of a secondary piece of it that isn't about how they look or how perfectly they're eating or how healthy or clean they're being, but also about something else in their life, how productive they're being, how they're performing at work, are they a good enough friend or a good enough parent? And then on the flip side, when someone comes in and maybe they're dealing more with a generalized anxiety that gets fixated on things like, do people like me, or I messed up in that presentation, there's often another piece of the puzzle that's like, and I didn't even work out today, or, pressure on themselves that's related to the way that they look or the way that they're eating or exercising. So yeah, so that's my deal. And then I wrote a book called Toxic Striving that looks at the cultural factors that kind of play into those concerns, diet culture, wellness culture, and hustle culture, and how to break free. So a lot of tools, a lot of like kind of self-help questions for reflection and building self-awareness so that you can build some resilience around those messages that tell you that you have to maximize every second of your day and that everything you do has to be productive and has to be in order to like move you towards some betterment or some goal, because that message is strong and a lot of people really internalize that in a way that creates a lot of suffering.
Yeah, I really like all of that. I mean, it is very wrapped up with each other as far as like striving to have the perfect version of yourself, the perfect diet, the perfect body, the perfect exercise routine. And then that overlaps with other parts of your life, being perfect in your career, being perfect. And like you said, maximizing your day as far as like having to do something every moment. And yeah, I do find that that's the case with a lot of people I work with eating disorders that also have issues with trying to be productive all the time, trying to be perfect all the time. So yeah, I really love how you're helping people kind of see that and see how that is a very toxic message in our culture that a lot of us get from a very young age. So yeah, I love all of that. I did want to dive into a little bit of the ADHD piece because a lot of people I've worked with over the years, I've had several questions come in like, hey, I have ADHD and I want to know, are there any specific strategies? How do I deal with my eating disorder when I also have ADHD? Because in the research, there is a correlation there as far as people with ADHD are more likely to develop eating disorders than people without ADHD. And the eating disorders they typically develop do involve binging and purging more commonly. And that's who I work with, people who are binging and purging. So yeah, let's just dive into that as far as like, why do you think that is the case that people with ADHD end up a little more susceptible to eating disorders?
Yeah. So I should also mention in my practice, we have a specialty in evaluating and diagnosing ADHD. And I've noticed, that same overlap and that same tendency where, so many people will come in with a lot of anxiety and with a lot of perfectionism and eating disorder symptoms. And then they also meet criteria for an ADHD diagnosis. My understanding or my kind of take, I guess, on why that's the case, from what I've seen, the research isn't super conclusive on like one clear reason, but that there's likely, kind of like with most things that are psychological in nature, a variety of factors, potentially some genetic components that might make someone predisposed to developing both an eating disorder, especially one that involves binging and purging, and being neurodivergent. The same is the case with autism spectrum. There's, high correlation with eating disorders a lot of the time. So yeah, that's my perspective, is that it is related to that neurodivergence, that someone with ADHD processes information differently, both information from the outside world and information from inside of your own body. So sensory information, things like hunger signals, fullness signals, thirst, the sensation of having a full bladder, all of those, interoceptive components that tell us what we need are sometimes just processed a little bit differently than maybe somebody who doesn't have ADHD. So that, I think, is one big piece of the puzzle. And then the other part of it is, someone with ADHD might have some impulsivity or some sensation seeking tendencies, and sometimes might find that eating can be a source of that sensory stimulation. So kind of like stimming in a way. And then the other thing that I think gets talked about a lot, or at least I've seen it a lot on social media, is how being on like a stimulant medication for ADHD can affect your appetite and sometimes blunt your hunger cues. So then you might end up kind of accidentally in a pattern of like a restrict binge if, while you're on the medication, you're not really as in touch with your hunger signals and not really eating consistently. And then it wears off and you're starving, and you might end up, eating in a way that is a binge because, you've been restricted. So there's a lot of factors that can kind of interfere with someone's relationship with food and kind of disrupt things.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It seems like there's a bit of a unique set of challenges that people with ADHD might have to deal with. And I want to circle back to that perfectionism piece. Do you feel like people with ADHD are more susceptible to that as far as like striving and perfectionism, or even have more trouble with that, like productivity? I guess, yeah, I just want to kind of tie in what we're talking about with ADHD to what you're talking about before with the perfectionism.
It's an interesting question. I wouldn't say yes or no, because everyone has a little bit of a different personality style. But I do think some of what I've seen, at least in working with people with ADHD, is can be very hard on themselves and very, have a very loud inner critic, especially because, we live in a world, our education system and things are kind of set up in a way that doesn't support someone with ADHD, or where you're sort of expected to just like go along with the mainstream way of learning or taking in information, sit still in a classroom all day long and sustain your attention for hours on end, and then maybe work in an office where you're sitting at a desk all day with very little variety or stimulation. So there's a lot in this system, I think, that can make it really hard for someone with ADHD to thrive and to do the things that work best for them when it comes to working or learning or processing information. So so then as a result, you might feel pretty demoralized if it's sort of like, I keep trying to do things the way other people are doing them, and it seems to come so easily for other people. Nobody else seems to have trouble, staying on emails or whatever it might be. And I'm the only one who struggles with this. And then, that can lead to a lot of self-criticism and perfectionism or striving to find ways to not mess up and, kind of fear of making mistakes or whatever.
It's interesting because I think all of us struggle in this culture, as far as like you were talking about having to be productive, like wellness culture, hustle culture, having to, always be accomplishing something. And people with ADHD may have unique struggles because it is harder for them to focus, harder for them to stay on top of things in the way that they think they should. And again, it's hard for all of us, but I think, like you said, it may put extreme pressure on people whose brains may not be set up to be able to do that as well as other people. So again, it's a struggle for all, but may uniquely impact someone with ADHD and make them think that they're doing something wrong or they're uniquely incapable of this, when really it's just the system around them that's set up to kind of, and I wouldn't say make them fail because they're not failing, but make them think they're failing.
Right. And I think you make a really good point that it's like everyone kind of struggles in in this environment and with these expectations that we're supposed to be productive, every moment of the day, or be able to sustain attention in the same way every day or whatever. But even just being aware that whether you have ADHD or not, your energy and your attention is going to ebb and flow, throughout the day or from day to day or different phases of your life. And that's totally normal. I think there's this misconception we have a lot that you can like program yourself. Like if you just program yourself correctly, then you're never going to have a day where you just can't focus, or, there must be a reason. If I'm not able to get as much work done as I think I should, it must be because I, didn't get enough REM sleep last night, or I didn't drink enough water. And, sometimes those are factors that obviously affect things, but this idea that I can crack the code and then just like follow a formula and be, like a machine that like operates the same every day, I think is kind of swirling around our culture. And I could speculate on why. I have a lot of theories, but I think, then on top of that, if you also are neurodivergent, you have ADHD, you're already not operating in the same way as somebody else. And if maybe you've gone without had a misdiagnosis during childhood, which is quite common. I see a lot of adults who are in their 30s and beyond who were never properly diagnosed as a kid. It was missed, and they went through all of their schooling dealing with these struggles and maybe being misperceived as acting out or not smart or not applying themselves or not motivated, right? And so then that kind of can follow you around and get in your head too, and really warp your self-perception in a way that can lead to a lot of like kind of negative self-talk and things like that.
Yeah, for sure. Which then doesn't help people who are also struggling with eating disorders too. Like that negative self-talk, that anxiety, that perfectionism can kind of get in the way of recovering from struggles with food. So I want to center on that a little bit as far as like helping people with ADHD uniquely recover from eating disorders. And I teach people it really comes down to two things as far as recovery. I know everyone has a unique path and different things they may need to work on, but as far as like stopping the binging and purging, it's about eating enough food, like eating adequately, making sure you're getting enough food every day so you're not in that restrictive cycle that leads to binging. And then also learning to not act on the urges to binge, because these urges that are arising in what I believe is your primitive brain, they can make you act in ways that you don't want to be acting. So it's really about that impulse control of not following those urges when they do come up. Like regardless of what you're doing, when those urges come up to help yourself not act, it's about eating enough food, not acting on those urges to binge. So that's kind of what I help people with. And people with ADHD like may have trouble with both of these goals uniquely, like eating enough food, because from my perception and experience, it can be hard for them, like you mentioned, to have those interoceptive cues as far as feeling their hunger and fullness, eating consistently, like staying focused enough to be able to know when it's meal times and pay attention to their hunger cues. And then also on the dismissing urges part or not acting on those binge urges, there can be those impulse control issues that can kind of make that a bit of a more challenging task. So that's kind of an overview of how I see it, but I want to get your take as far as like what unique challenges may someone face and then how they could overcome it. So as far as like what I was talking about, eating enough food, not acting on urges to binge, what challenges do you see and maybe what strategies could people use to help themselves overcome those issues?
Yeah, I think that, knowledge is power. I know that's kind of cliche, right? But I think that a useful first step can be developing insight into where you might have some of these differences in how you perceive information from your body. So there's actually like 3 ways that it can show up in someone who's neurodivergent and someone who's not potentially. You might be what's called an under responder, you might be an over responder, or you might have discrimination difficulties. So without getting too in the weeds, an under responder has trouble picking up on signals from their body until they're like screaming at them. So, I have ADHD myself, and I would probably characterize myself as more of an under responder where I'll notice that like maybe in the back of my mind, something might register at some point that like things are feeling a little off, but then all of a sudden out of nowhere, I'm like ravenous and I'm like, I have to eat right this second. And that can be really overwhelming because it's like, if you don't notice your signals earlier in the process, and you're ignoring your cues, you might end up, or not, I wouldn't say ignoring your cues, just not aware of or perceiving those cues. It can be hard to nourish yourself consistently throughout the day. And you might end up inadvertently, going hours and hours without eating and then binging because you're restricted, right? And same with other signals from your body. You might not notice that you have to go to the bathroom and your bladder is full till you're like about to pee your pants, So all of these things, I should say, can be supported by working with actually an occupational therapist who works with sensory differences. That can be really huge, or with a registered dietitian who's familiar with neurodivergence. I definitely encourage people, if you have access to it, to get some support from a professional who can help you figure out, like how are you processing sensory information, and then help you figure out some tools. So what I'm saying is kind of just like general tips, but I definitely would recommend going to an occupational therapist or looking up some occupational therapy resources because they're trained specialists in interoception. So if you're an under responder, being aware that your body, in order to keep your blood sugar consistent, you need to be eating every 3 to 4 hours throughout the day. So setting reminders for yourself, having things available that are just kind of quick and easy so that if you do reach that point of realizing, oh my gosh, I'm super hungry and, it's been a few hours, you don't have to then do all of the task management and executive functioning that's required to figure out what am I going to eat and how do I prepare it and put it together. So that's a useful thing. Also trying to make a point to eat, even if you're not hungry, within 2 hours of waking up can kind of like turn your system on a little bit more. And then also starting to pay attention to maybe not everybody experiences hunger as, growling stomach or some of the more kind of like classic symptoms. So noticing any change in your mood or your emotional state. Are you starting to feel really dysregulated or cranky, or, is that kind of like hanger, brain fog, things like that might indicate that, hey, I need to eat, so starting to kind of like look for maybe more creative ways to recognize what's going on. And also if you just don't pick up on anything, that's fine too, but, set yourself some alerts and try to be eating consistently. And then if someone's an over responder, they kind of have the opposite experience where like the smallest, what someone else might perceive as just like a mild change internally feels intense and overwhelming and really big. So that can lead to things like, the slightest, mildest hunger feels unbearable. And it's like, oh my gosh, I'm ravenous. I have to go eat something really quickly right now. or, our emotional states are also experienced as signals in the body. So someone who tends to be an overresponder might feel any, change in emotion can feel really unbearable, overwhelming, maybe lead to like an outburst or a sense of emotional dysregulation. So again, like being aware of if that's your tendency, what are some ways to learn some self-regulation skills, which again, you can do with a professional, a therapist, or an occupational therapist or a psychotherapist. Mindfulness practices, things like that can be really helpful too with like figuring out how do I like calm my nervous system when it's really dysregulated, and then soothe myself. Like it can be soothing to eat. I mean, again, I feel like I keep saying this, but come back to like every 3 to 4 hours, make sure you're eating something. And sometimes even just knowing like ahead of time, I'm going to be having my lunch break at this time, or I experiment with like having a small snack and see how that feels in your body and do a little soothing, and then know, okay, my next one's coming in an hour. That kind of thing can be useful. And then if someone has discrimination difficulties, it can feel really out of whack because they have trouble perceiving what's going on at all. So am I hungry, or am I thirsty, or am I tired, or am I getting a stomach ache? So in that case too, again, consistency in your day, having things that are readily available, and then sometimes like experimenting with, I think I'm hungry, but I might be something else. Let me take a few bites and just sort of notice if that shifts and makes a shift in my mood or my emotional state, my behavior, my energy. And if it's not that, kind of like trying to learn how to make more educated guesses as to what's going on. If you're someone who eats for sensory stimulation, I think you kind of alluded to this, I think the more tools in your toolkit, the more options you have and the more flexible you can be. So I don't like to take food away as an option for stimulation. I think that just can lead to it then feeling forbidden, which makes it feel like irresistible. And that like can make the urge stronger, can make you more fixated on this thing that you're not supposed to do. And you're trying to like white knuckle your way. And then if you cave, it feels like you failed and all of that. So food's an option, but it's one option. And like what else might be helpful for providing that, kind of sensory stimulation, those experiences that you're seeking. Maybe it is, moving your body in a certain type of way, or having like fidget objects that you can play with, trampoline, or something you can like bounce on, like one of those like yoga balls that you can bounce on. If you have like a drum, or even like a pen you can click, as long as you're not around people who that is going to drive nuts. But yeah, like if you're seeking sensory stimulation, look for what are a variety of ways I can do that. And again, food is an option on the table, but I encourage people to pick from a place of self-care and self-compassion. And if eating in the absence of hunger is a move of self-care, like that's great. If eating in the absence of hunger ends up making you maybe feel sick, or, have unwanted effects on how you feel in your body, then it might not be the self-care move. So yeah, that was kind of a long response, but I'm sure we'll think of more things as we're talking.
All of that's so helpful as far as giving people specific strategies. I love how you're saying food is an option for things other than hunger sometimes. Like I tell people that too, which like you don't have to tell yourself I can only eat when I'm hungry and I have to stop at the exact level of fullness, because that puts so much pressure on everyone, I think, but maybe more specifically people with ADHD or any sort of neurodivergence, that, it's more challenging to feel those signals, because then if you're having to really try to notice hunger because that's the only time you can eat, and you're not really noticing hunger, or you're having an over perception of hunger, like you said, in the over responders, it can just make it all so much more challenging. So I love how you just give people specific strategies. A lot of it seems like having acceptance of your own unique body and brain. Like, hey, this is how my body is responding. I need to learn to get in touch with my own unique signals that my own unique body and brain is sending me. And it's okay. Like, not for people to think, oh, I'm broken, something's wrong with me. It's like, hey, this is how my body is showing up. This is how my brain is showing up. And what support can I give myself? Whether that's, like you said, seeking occupational therapy or other forms of therapy, something to help you without criticizing yourself and saying that, I'm flawed in some deep way.
Exactly. Because everybody is wired a little bit differently. We all have different tendencies and preferences and ways that we, take in information and experience the world and experience our inner worlds too. And to hold up one as the ideal way of being over others doesn't account for just like the natural diversity among our species. So yeah, I think it's really important to practice acceptance and to sort of like work with your tendencies in some ways rather than against them, rather than trying to kind of like force yourself to fit in this box that maybe just isn't how you work best and isn't what's natural to you. And that's not to say you can't develop skills and tools and strategies and that you can't learn new ways of working through things and all of that, but that there might be certain things that work best for you, or help you calm your nervous system, or help you sustain focus on something when it's important to you, or help you, kind of balance your energy or your mood. So it's like, yeah, find those things and then embrace them. And it's okay if those things are different for you than for the next person, and the things that someone else does that help them function best or help them thrive in their own way are going to look different than yours. And also to really remember, I can't emphasize this enough, that like, you're not a machine. You can't just program yourself and expect you're going to operate the same way every moment of every day. You're a person and everything's going to ebb and flow. So to also like kind of honor that.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like too how you encourage people to eat consistently and to possibly set reminders for that. I mean, yes, having a more intuitive, in touch with your body approach to food can be so helpful for some people. I know you're a certified intuitive eating counselor as well, and that can absolutely be a great strategy for people. But if you are having more trouble with connecting with your own body signals, then just eating on the clock is also, I feel like it's also a form of intuition, like knowing yourself enough to know that following your body's signals doesn't always work. So sometimes you just need to set a timer and eat at that time.
It is intuitive to also use your mind to support you, and use your mind to say like, hey, what do I know about how often a person needs to eat throughout the day to have, stable blood sugar and to have enough calories throughout the day to have energy and to be able to function and, get through things. So using that, and of course, yeah, if you have the hunger signals there that you can honor, like that's really wonderful and great. But even someone with or without ADHD might not be perfectly in touch with their inner signals all the time. We get distracted, we get absorbed in things, like that's just life. And so to have this other awareness of, maybe I haven't noticed whether I'm hungry or not, but it's been however long since I last ate something. Or on the flip side, I know I'm not going to have the opportunity to eat for however long. Like I have this a lot when I'm, if I'm going into a long day with clinical stuff, like I'm not going to have the chance to eat for X amount of time. So even if I'm not that hungry, I'm going to still have a full meal because I'm looking out for future me. So that's a piece of it too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to talk about the urges to binge specifically. Like eating enough food really sets you up to be able to not act on those urges because you're nourished. You're not in that survival driven state where you ravenously need food. But as far as ADHD and anyone with any sort of issues with impulse control, how can someone really connect more with those self-control functions? I know you did touch on like emotional regulation as far as like if we're not in that fight or flight state, like when we're so anxious and so distressed, it is harder to access the prefrontal cortex, your self-control. So that's one thing, and maybe you could hit on that a little more. But then what other strategies can someone use to really get in touch more with their self-control functions?
So self-control functions meaning
like I want to do something, but I'm not going to do it. Like I want to binge. I'm feeling the urge to binge and I'm not going to binge. And some people tell me like, oh, it's happening so fast. It's happening so automatically. Like I'm just acting on it before I kind of realize it. And I don't feel like I'm having control in these moments. And some of those people who tell me that also say, okay, I have also have ADHD or some sort of neurodivergence. So how can we work with people to help them in those moments where they're not following their brain's automatic impulses?
To kind of slow yourself down and recognize here's what's going on. Yeah, I mean, any regular mindfulness practice, it's like a muscle where the more you use it, the stronger it gets, and the more easily you can access that ability to be aware of what's going on in the moment and like kind of sit with those experiences without immediately acting on them. And then that can, in turn help you discern a little bit more, like, all right, I'm feeling these urges to do XYZ, whatever it might be. I do think I appreciate your approach, really emphasizing that you cannot be restricted. And because I think that's really hard too. What I find a lot is that people will still be binging and they think that they are eating enough or that they're getting enough variety to not be restricted, but like they actually are deprived in some way if you kind of like pull the hood of the car back a little bit more and look a little bit deeper. So I think, I'm not saying like that's always the case, but I do think a lot of the time if someone's still struggling with binge eating after they're apparently, fully nourished and getting enough variety and not restricting and have no rules and all of that, it's like sometimes there is sort of like a sneaky rule in there that they weren't aware of before. So I think you have to do a lot of digging there and a lot of like being honest with yourself, because I find that's hard too, is like there's, defenses are so strong and oftentimes they're so unconscious that some might truly believe I'm not restricting in any way. And then, they actually are. So assuming all of that is settled and someone still is dealing with, maybe they're, turning to a binge to try to self-soothe or try to have that like sensory stimulation seeking kind of thing, then yeah, I would say building more of the, mindfulness skills and also, practicing like, what is it that I'm looking for in these moments? The same thing with an urge to do anything that maybe doesn't align with your values or doesn't align with the person you want to be, any behavior that, that looking back on it later, you wouldn't be proud of. Maybe it's, drinking excessively or using a drug or doing something that, would be harmful to you or would take you away from things that are important to you, but you have the urge still to do it. Figure out what is it that I'm really seeking here. I'm looking for soothing. I'm looking for distraction. I'm looking for numbing. I'm looking for escape, and to find what are some alternatives that might help you, kind of in the moment, just like ride out the urge to do something that, you're going to have, that, is going to create more stress in your life or it's going to take you away from the person you want to be. And if that's the case, like maybe that's also not the case. So like sometimes eating to cope with emotions doesn't take you away from the person you want to be, or doing it sometimes and having other tools available other times is fine too. Like only you can, I think that's up to the individual. Like our society also puts all this pressure on like eating when you're not hungry is always bad.
Yeah, I hear that too. Yeah, people think that stopping binging means stopping every form of emotional eating ever. And I don't think that's the case. Like if you're sad and you just want some ice cream, have some ice cream. Like it's the amounts, it's the feeling of being out of control. Binging is a different experience than just eating to soothe sometimes as one thing that you may use to soothe yourself. Like you mentioned before, which I really like, if eating is one part of a variety of things you do to soothe yourself, then it can be totally fine. And it doesn't take you away from who you want to be. And I really like that framework. Like, does this take me away from who I want to be? And in a lot of cases, little emotional eating doesn't do that. But when it's extreme and when it's in the form of binging and when it's making you so sick and you're just really feeling bad after, then of course it takes you away from the person you want to be. And I like how you mentioned too that the mindfulness practices are helpful as far as like just practicing over and over. Like I can have this urge from my brain, like regardless of kind of where it's coming from or what it's leading me toward, I can have urges and I can practice over and over not responding to them. And that muscle is going to get stronger. And someone with some neurodivergence and ADHD may have to practice more times. It could come more naturally to some people and it could be more challenging to others. And that's okay. Like we're all different, but we can still build that skill.
Exactly. And that's why they say it's like a practice, right? Because nobody, even someone who meditates every day, is able to just be present with themselves and aware and attuned in their body 24/7. We all tune out. We all get distracted. We all get disconnected from ourselves. But if you do it on the regular, you do start to get more of that mind-body connection intact and it becomes more accessible and what's going on when it's going on. I'm feeling this, and sometimes it doesn't happen until after the fact, after the binge or after the thing that you kind of like blacked out for and weren't aware of what was going on till it's over. And can you kind of like make some slow progress towards recognizing what's happening earlier and earlier in that process, and not beat yourself up. I think that very little awareness comes from self-criticism. Like, you can't shame yourself into growth. So if you do something that you end up regretting or not being, pleased with what choice you made or whatever, right? Or sometimes it happens so automatically you don't realize what you're doing, to stop and get curious. Like, what was going on earlier in the day? What was going on in my emotional state? Who was I with? Where was I? Right? Because you might start to recognize that there are some other factors in place that sort of set you up to be disconnected from yourself in that moment.
Yeah, for sure. When you have that awareness, you can start to prevent yourself from kind of spiraling. Like, you recognize it earlier in the process. Hey, when this happens, sometimes I start getting urges to binge, or sometimes I start not eating, or whatever, like whatever your patterns are, you can point them out and then recognize it earlier and earlier in the cycle, and then therefore stop the cycle.
Know that it's, again, not about perfection, not about being perfectly self-aware and always catching yourself when at the beginning of an urge to do something that isn't aligned with who you want to be. It could be just knowing that sometimes it does take me longer to realize it. But like you were saying, if I'm also aware of certain factors that are sort of like activating situations for me, certain people or certain, just times in my life or seasons, right, where maybe I'm more prone to struggling, or I'm more prone to feeling overwhelmed or whatever, then I can build in some other ways to support myself in those experiences. Again, it's not a guarantee that I'm not going to have an urge, or that I'm not going to like act on an urge to do something that I don't want to do, but just to sort of like support myself,
Yeah. And this could go for anyone, like not just people who are neurodivergent. And I want to wrap this up by having a little more broad conversation as far as how wellness culture, hustle culture, fitness culture is affecting all of us, and sort of what we can do about it to not be pulled into those toxic messages. So yeah, like, how do you see like the state of fitness culture and wellness culture and hustle culture right now? How do you see it affecting all of us? And then, what can we do?
Yeah, it's a big question. So that's, what my book is about, toxic strategy. So definitely, if this conversation makes you curious to do a deeper dive, that would be a great place to go. But I see it as like a nature nurture combo, and like the nurture would be the cultural stuff that we have going on right now. It definitely feels like there's this belief that's out there in kind of the dominant world that we can be hacked. Like, we're, like the biohacking is like a big thing, that if you want a certain body, or you want a certain health outcome, or you want a certain, job title, or you want to reach a certain thing, you just have to find the right way to program yourself, and the right tools and the right strategies. And you can buy my program to get yourself there. Here's the 10 steps you have to follow. And, there are a lot of people who obviously are capitalizing on that and want to make money off of your insecurities and your beliefs about yourself. But I think that has become more and more prevalent, this idea that, if I'm not performing the way that I think I should, or the way that I want to, it's because of me. It's because I'm not doing enough, or I haven't cracked the code, or I haven't figured it out. Diet culture makes us feel this way around, weight loss and body size and that kind of thing, right? It's like, if you don't have the body that society holds up as ideal, it's because you're not doing XYZ, or you're not doing enough of certain things, as opposed to just sort of like respecting and honoring, again, the diversity that has always been across our species.
Yeah. And I want to stop you there and say that like that can make people then more susceptible to eating disorders, because like people who don't even know they're susceptible to an eating disorder think, oh, let me just do this thing. Let me just follow this diet because that's what diet culture is telling me that I need to do if I want this ideal. And then they start not eating enough. They start having binge urges. They start going down the path of really struggling with food. So like, yeah, like this whole cultural issue is creating eating disorders.
100%. Yes. And I think, social media is a piece of the puzzle, right? Because everything is also like then put on display in this like curated way, that it's not enough to just live your life. You have to like live it in an aesthetically pleasing way, and, like seek approval of strangers on the internet, or, look to someone else on the internet to tell you how to be or what to do. And then I think the nature piece of it is that like there are certain, we're all born with a different temperament and tendencies and preferences and ways that we operate. And I think that there's kind of this like toxic striving combo or cocktail that some people have. I know, I'm one of those people where I maybe have a natural tendency to strive and to want to like do really well at everything I try and be liked by everyone. And I mean, then that also got combined with some conditioning of, you're good if you do those things, because there are people who grow up surrounded by these messages and aren't as fazed by them and don't develop an eating disorder or, perfectionism or get sort of like spiral into these people pleasing tendencies or anything like that. They're able to sort of like stay on their square and stand their ground and just live unapologetically. And then there are people who it's harder to do that or are more susceptible to the messages. So what can we do about it? I mean, I think society systems are slow to change. So I don't think we're going to get rid of this messaging probably in our lifetime. But if you can try to be intentional about what you're letting into your awareness and the messages that you're letting in and the people that you're close with and forming connections with, and try to create connections and community with people who don't have those expectations that you're going to like be perfect all the time, or that you should be productive, or that make you feel like you're like lazy or bad if you're not doing XYZ, that kind of like unapologetic stuff. But also like get in touch with your values and figure out what matters to you. And the bottom line is like life is short and you're the only one living your life. So if you find that you're living it trying to hit these metrics that you've been taught you're supposed to chase after, whether it's a job title or an accolade or, a certain income level or a certain aesthetic or body size, or, your face is supposed to look a certain way and you're supposed to fight aging, whatever it might be. Like if you find yourself kind of like treating those as the things that matter and the things that are your ticket to like a good life, but then you stop and you ask yourself, is that actually the life I want? And is this the chase that I'm on to try to get those things? Is that how I want to be spending my energy and my money and my time and, my mental space? I think you can get a lot more clarity that way. And that's why I have a lot of reflection questions in the book to sort of help you on that process and to be able to look inward and to sort of like strip away the cultural conditioning that you got and strip away the messaging that you got that tells you what you're supposed to care about, and get more in touch with what do I actually care about? Because I think that's where it all can really stem from, is if I can live a life that's more aligned with what I actually care about, which is hard to do when it goes against with what maybe you've been taught is like what you're supposed to be doing. Yeah. But if you can do that, you can have a lot more freedom and just enjoy your life a lot more.
Yeah, all that's really helpful. And I read your book, and that's what I love about it is you're not telling people don't go after goals or don't try to be healthy or don't aim for any sort of fitness. Like, absolutely, you should go after the goals that are important to you. It's just like not looking out at the culture and looking on social media and letting that determine what you should be doing. Because if you live your life from this place of, oh, I should do this and I have to do this and I have to do this, you're not ever doing what you really want to do. So it's helping you get in touch with what you want and then helping you go after goals in a healthy, sustainable way.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And in a way that is more focused on the process than the outcome. Because if you're chasing after something because of whatever the result is, but the actual process of moving towards it is, depleting you and making you miserable, life is happening now too, while you're doing that chase. Right. So if I'm after a certain, whatever body size and the process is miserable, then how important is that outcome to me? I think sometimes we get attached to like the outcome. We think it's going to be this amazing, I'm going to reach this goal and then everything in my life is going to be great and I'm just going to be happy forever, and then you get to whatever the goal is and that's not the case, because life is still life. And no matter how many goals you achieve, you're always going to have, ups and downs in your emotions and hard times and times where you're cranky and grumpy and down on yourself and sad and angry and all of the things. Right. So like to also sort of detach a little from, if like it's great to move towards things that are meaningful to you without getting so wrapped up in I have to get there, because like if I get there, everything's going to be great, because that's just not how life works. So it's, recognizing too that that's an illusion.
Yeah, I think this whole conversation is so helpful to anyone, but also specifically for people with eating disorders, because as we've been talking about this whole time, it's so important to eat enough food, right, to recover. And if you're so wrapped up in these cultural goals of like perfectionism, it's just going to be really hard to eat enough food. So like everything you're talking about, I feel like can help people let go of this the struggle with dieting and this issue of trying to control their body size. Like that is so important to let go of in recovery. And sometimes to let go of that can be a little more complicated than letting go of like the binging itself, because it does involve all those cultural messages, all those things you heard growing up, all the ways that you think you're supposed to show up in the world. And it can be a bit of a letting go process as far as like just letting go of all that. And I think your book and this whole idea of toxic striving and learning to see that and recognize that in your own life. And I think it can just really be something that supports people in recovery. So I definitely encourage people to get your book. And maybe to wrap up, you could just tell people how they can find it and how they can find you on social media or learn more about you.
Yeah. So you could go to toxicstriving.com if you wanted to see all of the ways to buy it, but Amazon, Barnes and Noble, your local bookstore, a lot of like the Barbara's bookstores and the bookstores in the airport have been having it, which has been exciting to see. Great read if you're traveling.
Nice.
But yeah, and then Bookshop also, if you wanted to, support local bookstores. And there's a audio version too, for people who don't like to read with their eyes. And there's a Kindle version. And yeah, please check it out. I would love feedback. I'd love to know what people think. And I really just hope that it's a helpful resource and, kind of the last self-help book that you ever really need, because my whole message is that you're the expert on yourself and you're the expert on your own body, mind, and life. And you don't need these mandates from the outside world to tell you how to live. So yeah, that's the goal and the hope. And then you can find me on Instagram, Mindful Dr. Paula, and all my links and things are on there too. My practice is called HumanKind Psychological Services. I'm based in Chicago. So if someone wanted to work with a therapist in my practice, they can find us there. And I think that's all my things.
Awesome. Yeah. And I'll include links to all that in the show description as well. And yeah, thank you so much for being here today. It's been a great conversation.
Thanks again for having me.
I hope that you found this conversation useful and inspiring as well, and that you'll check out Dr. Paula's resources. You can also find the Brain Over Binge resources in the show description, including my books, online course that's only $18.99 per month. You can also learn about group coaching and one-on-one coaching with me or Coach Julie. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I hope you'll listen again next time. As always, I want to encourage you and remind you that you have the power to change your brain and live a binge-free life. The Brain Over Binge podcast is produced and recorded by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC. All work is copyrighted by Brain Over Binge Recovery Coaching, LLC, and all rights are reserved. As a disclaimer, the host of the Brain Over Binge podcast are not professional counselors or licensed healthcare providers, and this podcast is not a substitute for medical advice or any form of professional therapy. Eating disorders can have serious health consequences, and you are strongly advised to seek medical attention for matters relating to your health. Please get help when you need it, and good luck on your journey.